Barcelona.
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 This is the story of how a football empire, once the envy of the entire world, was brought to its knees. Not by a rival on the pitch, but by a catastrophic series of gambles, gross mismanagement, and a level of arrogance that was almost hard to believe. It's a tale of how a club that defined an era, a club that preached a philosophy of virtue and homegrown talent, ended up buried under a mountain of debt that topped €1 billion. We'll follow the key figures, the fatal mistakes, and the one heartbreaking moment that symbolized it all, the forced exit of their greatest player ever. This is the scandal that destroyed FC Barcelona's empire, a downfall so spectacular, and so completely self-inflicted, that it stands as a chilling warning to the entire world of sport. We're going to break down exactly where it all went wrong, from the corridors of power to the sacred grass of the Camp Nou, and expose how a beautiful dream devolved into a financial and existential nightmare. Just over a decade ago, FC Barcelona wasn't simply a football club, it was an ideal. Under Pep Guardiola, with the holy trinity of Lionel Messi, Xavi Hernandez, and Andres Iniesta, they played a style of football called tiki-taka that felt less like a tactic and more like a work of art. They were the most feared and revered club on the planet, winning trophy after trophy with a style that was both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally effective. They were a MSQUN club, more than a club, a slogan that captured their unique identity, their commitment to Catalan culture, and their legendary La Masia Academy, a production line of world-class talent. By all accounts, they were on top of the world. Fast forward to today, and that empire is in ruins. The club found itself in a state of financial paralysis, with a staggering gross debt that at €1.35 billion. Their iconic stadium, the Camp Nou, became a construction site, forcing the team into a smaller, temporary home. And their most legendary player, Lionel Messi, was forced out in a tearful press conference, a victim not of declining skill, but of a balance sheet so toxic the club literally couldn't afford to keep him. So, how did it come to this? How did the symbol of footballing purity become the poster child for financial ruin? The answer isn't a single event, but a slow, creeping decay, a death by 1,000 cuts, dealt by the very people who were supposed to protect the institution. To truly understand the depths of the fall, you must first be transported to the heavens they fell from. The philosophy that defined Barcelona was a seed planted decades earlier by the club's spiritual father, the legendary Johan Cruyff. His arrival as a player in the 70s was revolutionary, but his return as a manager in 1988 was scripture. He brought with him the Dutch concept of total football, a fluid system where any player could take over the role of any other. From this, he built the Barcelona way. The ball was a precious jewel, to be cherished and never given away. His dream team of the early 90s won the club's first ever European Cup, but his most enduring legacy was a place, La Masia. It was an old Catalan farmhouse converted into a football academy, a place that would become the cornerstone of the club's identity. It was here that Cruyff's philosophy was drilled into generations of young boys, teaching them not just how to play, but how to think, how to understand space, and how to live the Barcelona way. This foundation gave birth to the Guardiola era, a period of almost mythical dominance between 2008 and 2012. Guardiola, himself a product of La Masia and a disciple of Cruyff, perfected this philosophy into a style so hypnotic it was given a name, tiki-taka. It was a symphony of one-touch passes, a whirlwind of constant movement where players formed triangles all over the pitch, seeming to communicate telepathically. The objective was simple but profound: if you have the ball, the opponent cannot score. Watching them was to witness a masterpiece being painted in real time. This period saw Barcelona win an incredible 14 of a possible 19 trophies. The engine room of this dynasty wasn't a checkbook, it was La Masia. In the 2011 Champions League final at Wembley, Barcelona produced what many consider the single greatest team performance in history, dismantling a powerhouse Manchester United side. They won 3-1, but the scoreline didn't do justice to the absolute dominance they displayed. 8 players in that starting lineup were from La Masia. The philosophy reached its zenith in 2010, in a moment that may never be repeated. The 3 best players on the entire planet, the finalists for the FIFA Ballon d'Or, were all products of the academy: Messi, Xavi, and Iniesta. They were generational talents who had learned the game together since they were children. This golden age wasn't just a commercial juggernaut, it was the validation of an idea. It was proof that a team could win with beauty, dominate with ideals, and conquer the world with players who wore the badge not just on their shirt, but in their hearts. But as this perfect generation began to age and its architects moved on, a new leadership inherited this masterpiece. First under President Sandro Rosell, who resigned amidst allegations of misappropriation of funds, and then his successor. In their arrogance, they decided they could improve it, not with philosophy, but with money, a decision that would ultimately set the entire cathedral ablaze. Every great tragedy has a point of no return, a moment where one bad decision triggers an unstoppable chain reaction. For FC Barcelona, that moment arrived cloaked in the humid air of the summer of 2017. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a rumor that slithered through the corridors of world football, so audacious it was initially dismissed as fantasy. The rumor was that Neymar Jr., the Brazilian superstar, the jester prince to Messi's king, the man anointed as the heir to the throne, wanted to leave. More than that, it was whispered that Paris Saint-Germain, a club transforming under the limitless wealth of its Qatari ownership, was preparing to do the unthinkable. The initial reaction from the Barcelona boardroom, led by President Josep Maria Bartomeu, was one of dismissive arrogance. This was FC Barcelona. Players didn't leave Barcelona in their prime, they arrived at Barcelona to reach it.
Clubs are interested in him. Well, this is something that happens almost all the summers, that, well, not only in Barca, in all the clubs, well.
The idea was an insult. Bartomeu, a man whose presidency was defined by a corporate, often detached, view of the club, projected an aura of absolute control. The rumors were waved away as media games, as attempts by rival forces to destabilize their project. Publicly, the message was unequivocal. Neymar wasn't just staying, he was the future. Privately, they pointed to his contract, to a number so enormous, so deliberately prohibitive, it was considered a fortress wall, a €222 million release clause. In the history of football, no fee had ever come close. It was a figure designed not as a price tag, but as a statement of untouchability. It was a financial Everest no club was meant to climb. They believed it made him a prisoner in a golden cage, and they held the only key. They were wrong. What Bartomeu and his board failed to comprehend was that this wasn't about football anymore. This was about power. The challenge wasn't coming from a traditional rival like Real Madrid, it was coming from a new global entity for whom money was a political tool. PSG, backed by the sovereign wealth of a nation-state, saw the €222 million not as a barrier, but as an opportunity. It was a chance to detonate a bomb in the center of the old world order, to announce their arrival not just as a financial power, but as a dominant political force in the sport. Paying the clause wasn't just buying a player, it was buying legitimacy. It was a corporate raid disguised as a transfer. It was a geopolitical statement that would echo from the banks of the Seine to the shores of the Mediterranean. On August 3, 2017, the fantasy became a brutal reality. Representatives for Neymar Jr. walked into the La Liga offices, not to negotiate, but to deposit a check. The transfer didn't just break the world record, it obliterated it, more than doubling the previous high mark. The news shattered Barcelona. It wasn't just a business transaction, it was a public humiliation of staggering proportions. Bartomeu's confident assurances now looked foolish, his authority eviscerated. A crown jewel hadn't just been sold, it had been ripped from the vault while the guards boasted of how secure it was. The club that saw itself as the pinnacle of the sport had been made to look powerless, a legacy institution raided by new money. Inside the club, the shock curdled into pure, unfiltered panic. The departure of a key player was a sporting problem. The nature of his departure, however, was an existential crisis. It was an attack on the club's prestige, on its very identity as a destination club. The response from Bartomeu and his board was not calm, it was not strategic, it was not rational. It was a primal scream of wounded pride. They looked at the €222 million sitting in their bank account, and they didn't see an opportunity to rebuild patiently, to reinvest in the philosophy that had made them great. They saw it as tainted money, blood money that was burning a hole in their pocket. They felt the eyes of the world upon them, the sneers of their rivals, the fury of their own fan base. They had to act. They had to project strength, even if they felt none. They had to show the world that Barcelona was still a giant, that they could not be bullied. And so, with the world watching, they launched the single most reckless, disastrous, and self-destructive spending spree in the history of football. Their desperation was a scent in the water, and the sharks began to circle. Every club in Europe knew two things: Barcelona had a mountain of cash, and they were in a desperate hurry to spend it. The first target was a young, electrifyingly talented French winger from Borussia Dortmund, Ousmane Dembélé. He was a player of immense potential, a blur of speed and skill. But he was also a gamble. He was raw, inconsistent, and, crucially, came with a well-documented history of disciplinary issues. He was the antithesis of the typical La Masia graduate, who was schooled not just in technique, but in temperament and tactical discipline. Under normal circumstances, he would have been a speculative, high-risk, high-reward signing. But these were not normal circumstances. Barcelona were negotiating from a position of profound weakness, and Dortmund knew it. The German club held firm. They named a price that, just weeks earlier, would have been considered absurd. Barcelona, blinded by panic and the need for a public relations victory, barely flinched. The negotiations became a masterclass in extortion. As Dortmund played hardball, Dembélé, sensing his opportunity, went on strike, refusing to train to force the move. It was a red flag the size of a stadium banner, a clear warning about the player's professionalism. But Barcelona's board wasn't looking for character, they were looking for a headline. They needed a replacement, and they needed him now. The price swelled to an obscene figure, an initial fee of €105 million, with a further €40 million in potential add-ons. It was, at the time, the second most expensive transfer in history, second only to the man he was supposed to replace. For a 20-year-old with just one breakout season in a top league, it was pure madness. They had taken a significant portion of the Neymar money and immediately set it on fire, paying a premium not just for the player's talent, but for his problematic attitude. They had gambled nearly €150 million on a player who was, at best, unproven and, at worst, a ticking time bomb of unprofessionalism. It was the first catastrophic error, a decision born not of logic, but of fear. But the panic was a fever that had not yet broken. One signing wasn't enough to cover the shame of losing Neymar. The gaping psychological wound remained. The fans were not placated, the media was still critical, and the ghost of Neymar still haunted the Camp Nou. The board felt they needed another marquee name, another blockbuster signing to fully signal their intent and change the narrative. Their gaze turned to the Premier League, to Liverpool's Brazilian magician, Philippe Coutinho. Here was another brilliant player, a creative force capable of moments of breathtaking genius. And once again, the selling club held all the power. Liverpool had no desire to sell their talisman. They, like Dortmund, saw Barcelona's desperation and prepared to exploit it to the fullest. The pursuit of Coutinho was even more revealing of the board's broken strategy. The primary question driving a transfer of this magnitude should be tactical: how does this player fit into our system? But that question was never properly answered. Barcelona's system, for a decade, had revolved around the gravitational pull of Lionel Messi. He was the sun. Other players had to be planets orbiting him, complementing him, creating space for him. Coutinho was not a planet, he was another sun. He thrived in a free role as the central creative hub of his team, drifting into the very spaces that Messi had made his own. To anyone with a basic understanding of Barcelona's tactical identity, he was a square peg for a very expensive, round hole. But the board was not concerned with tactics. They were concerned with optics. Coutinho was a star. He sold shirts. His signing would be a global statement. And so, they paid. That winter, after a relentless and public pursuit, they finally broke Liverpool's resolve with a fire hose of cash. The final deal was mind-boggling, even by the new, inflated standards they themselves had helped create. A base fee of €120 million, with another €40 million in variables. Philippe Coutinho became the most expensive signing in the history of FC Barcelona. In the space of just 6 months, the club had reacted to losing one €222 million player by committing over €300 million to 2 replacements. They had spent all the Neymar money, and then they had plunged themselves deep into debt to spend even more. They had done it without a coherent plan, buying players who didn't fit their system or their culture, paying prices that were grotesquely inflated by their own desperation. This was the original sin. It was a moment of institutional collapse, a complete and utter betrayal of the club's founding philosophy. The patient, nurturing model of La Masia, the idea of building a team from within, of promoting a sacred style of play, it was all tossed aside in a fit of pique. They had abandoned the teachings of Cruyff for the short-term adrenaline rush of the transfer market. They were no longer setting the market, they were being played by it, fleeced by clubs who could see their panic from a mile away. The signings of Dembélé and Coutinho were not just financial blunders, they were philosophical poison. They signaled a fundamental shift in the club's soul. They were now a club that reacted, that chased names, that believed money could solve any problem. They had inherited a cathedral built on decades of genius and decided its foundations would be stronger if they were replaced with stacks of cash. The Neymar money wasn't a gift, it was a curse. It was the seed from which a forest of financial mismanagement would grow, a forest so thick, so dark, and so suffocating, it would eventually block out all the light from their golden era, plunging the entire institution into a nightmare from which it has yet to fully awaken. The fuse for self-destruction had been lit. If the Neymar transfer lit the fuse, the presidency of Josep Maria Bartomeu was the vast, leaking tanker of gasoline that guaranteed the entire institution would go up in flames. Bartomeu, an entrepreneur by trade, ascended to the presidency in 2014, not through a triumphant mandate, but as the successor to Sandro Rosell, who had resigned under a cloud of scandal. From the very beginning, Bartomeu's leadership was characterized by a cold, corporate sensibility that was fundamentally alien to the spirit of a club owned by its members. He viewed this hallowed institution not as a cultural treasure to be protected, but as a global brand to be leveraged, a content provider whose primary assets were famous faces. His reign was not just a period of bad decisions, it was a slow, systemic hollowing out of the club's very soul, a masterclass in how to mistake commercial activity for a coherent sporting project, and in doing so, how to steer a magnificent ship directly into an iceberg of your own making. The transfer policy, already thrown into chaos by the panic post-Neymar spending spree, didn't just get worse, it devolved into a tragicomedy of errors, a series of decisions so baffling they seemed designed by a committee with no understanding of football. The boardroom's approach to recruitment became something akin to a fantasy football player with unlimited funds and zero tactical awareness. They weren't building a team, they were collecting stars, like a child collecting stickers, driven by the fame of the name rather than the fit. The most glaring example of this philosophy of brand over brains came in 2019. The target was Antoine Griezmann, the jewel of Atletico Madrid, a World Cup winner and a bona fide global superstar. The price tag was a staggering €120 million. On paper, it was a statement. In reality, it was an act of profound strategic negligence. The most basic question was never adequately addressed: where, in a team that already revolved entirely around the twin attacking gravitational fields of Lionel Messi and his close friend Luis Suarez, was a player like Griezmann supposed to play? Griezmann, like Messi, was not a simple winger or a target man. He was a wanderer, a creative fulcrum who thrived by drifting into the same central spaces that Messi had copyrighted for over a decade. He was, like Coutinho before him, another sun being jammed into a solar system designed for one. But such pedestrian concerns as tactics or team chemistry were brushed aside. Griezmann was a famous name, a marketable face. His signing would be a global headline, a projection of financial muscle. And so, the club once again threw an astronomical sum at a player who represented a solution to a problem that didn't exist, while ignoring the glaring holes elsewhere in the squad. It was the pinnacle of a strategy that prioritized the splashy announcement video over the on-field result, a policy of assembling a collection of brilliant, but incompatible, soloists, and then acting surprised when they failed to form a coherent orchestra. This was not an isolated incident, it was the defining pattern. The absurdity reached its peak with a transfer that continues to baffle football analysts to this day, the bizarre swap deal with Juventus involving Arthur Melo and Miralem Pjanic. On the surface, the numbers were enormous, but the transaction was less about football and more about financial deception. It was a masterpiece of what the board likely saw as creative accounting, a cynical shell game designed to cosmetically balance the books for a single financial year. They were trading Arthur, a young, promising midfielder whose one-touch passing style had earned him comparisons, however premature, to the legendary Xavi, for Pjanic, a fine player, but one who was significantly older and entering the twilight of his career. In essence, Barcelona was sacrificing a potential piece of its future for a short-term accounting trick that would allow them to report an artificial profit. It was a move that laid bare the board's warped priorities. They were no longer managing a football club for long-term success, they were managing a balance sheet for short-term survival, treating talented young players not as human assets to be nurtured, but as abstract figures to be shuffled around in a desperate bid to hide the ever-deepening cracks in the foundation. And then there were the smaller, almost forgotten blunders that, when viewed together, paint a picture of total chaos. There was the signing of Malcolm for €41 million, a deal famously hijacked at the 11th hour when the player was literally about to board a flight to sign for AS Roma. It was a show of power, a flex of financial muscle for its own sake. But after the triumphant signing, the club seemed to have no idea what to do with him. He was barely played, left to wither on the sidelines, a constant reminder of the board's impulsive, plan-less approach, before being quietly sold off a year later. The problem was never a lack of attacking talent, the squad was overflowing with it. The problem was the utter, almost defiant, absence of a coherent vision. The club was a rudderless ship, caught in a storm of its own making, with a captain who seemed content to simply purchase more expensive decorations for the cabins while the hull was taking on water. But the grotesque transfer fees, as damaging as they were merely the visible tip of the financial iceberg. The truly catastrophic, soul-crushing damage was being done silently, invisibly, in the fine print of player contracts. The wage bill, under Bartomeu's stewardship, became the real cancer eating the club from within. It spiraled into a dimension of recklessness that defied all logic, all precedent, and all regulations. It ballooned to over €600 million per year, a figure so monstrous it became the highest wage bill not just in football, but in the entire history of professional sports. This wasn't merely unsustainable, it was a flagrant violation of the financial guardrails put in place by Spain's La Liga. The league's own rules stipulated that a club's total spending on salaries should not exceed 70% of its total revenue, a sensible measure to ensure financial stability. At its nadir under Bartomeu, Barcelona's wage-to-income ratio climbed past 80%, then 90%, before ultimately screaming past the 100% mark. Let that number sink in. The club was contractually obligated to spend more money on player salaries alone than it was generating in total income from every single source: tickets, TV rights, merchandise, everything. It was the financial equivalent of trying to breathe in a vacuum. It was a declaration of institutional insanity. This was a crisis born of a toxic culture of indulgence. Contracts were no longer negotiated, they were dispensed like party favors at a lavish feast where no one cared who was picking up the tab. In a desperate attempt to keep the successful team of the past together, the board handed out obscenely lucrative, long-term extensions to aging veterans. These were deals that rewarded past glory with future-destroying salaries, effectively paying players for what they had done, not what they were going to do. This policy locked the club into astronomical wages for a squad that was visibly declining, creating a gilded cage of has-beens and legends past their prime. Meanwhile, new signings were lured in with promises of massive paychecks, a strategy that only threw more fuel onto the raging fire of the wage bill. Every negotiation seemed to begin from a position of weakness and end in a capitulation that mortgaged another piece of the club's future. And then, there was the contract. The one deal so monumental, so incomprehensibly vast, it would become the defining symbol of the Bartomeu era's disconnect from reality. In January 2021, the Spanish newspaper El Mundo published a leak that sent shockwaves not just through football, but through the entire world. It was the full, unredacted details of Lionel Messi's final 4-year contract, signed back in 2017. The world gasped. The total value of the deal, including salary, signing-on fees, and a labyrinth of clauses and bonuses, was worth up to a mind-shattering €555,237,619. Over €500 million. It was, by an astronomical margin, the largest contract ever given to an athlete in the history of sports. It worked out to roughly €138 million per year. €380,000 per day. €15,800 per hour. No one could argue Messi's value on the pitch. He was a phenomenon, a living legend whose goals and assists had generated immense revenue and glory for the club. But the number itself was a monument to a boardroom that had lost its mind. It was a symbol of a leadership so terrified of losing its primary asset, so desperate to maintain the illusion of control, that it was willing to sign a check that the club, in any rational sense, could not afford to cash. They were acting not like the custodians of a member-owned club, but like the reckless rulers of a petro-state with a bottomless pit of oil money. The contract was a desperate, panic gamble, a belief that as long as the king remained in the castle, no one would notice that the walls were crumbling and the treasury was empty. The truth was, the treasury had been empty for a long time. The entire operation was being run like a pyramid scheme, a frantic juggling act of debt and delusion. Bartomeu's administration was financing today's extravagance by borrowing relentlessly against tomorrow's income. They were taking out massive loans, much of it crippling short-term debt that came with punishing interest rates. Internal reports, once they finally surfaced, would reveal a horrifying reality. The club owed hundreds of millions of euros in unpaid transfer fees to other clubs, for players who, in some cases, were not even playing for Barcelona anymore. They were paying off one credit card with another, all while continuing to spend with the abandon of a lottery winner on a spree. They were selling off future television rights and other assets, kicking the can down a road that was rapidly leading towards a cliff. They were building a magnificent house of cards, praying that the wind would never change. But the on-field success that had papered over the cracks for so long was beginning to fade, and the illusion they had spent so much to maintain was about to be shattered in the most brutal and public way imaginable. The financial rot was complete. The stage was set for the empire to crumble not just on the balance sheet, but on the sacred grass of the pitch itself. The financial rot that had festered in the boardroom inevitably began to metastasize on the pitch. The astronomical wage bill wasn't funding a team of champions, it was bankrolling a collection of ghosts, legends past their prime and expensive misfits who didn't fit the system. The team that was once a symbol of synergy and tactical genius became a disjointed, fragile caricature of its former self. This was a team built by marketers, not football minds, and the results were a trilogy of historic, soul-crushing humiliations in the Champions League, each more damning than the last. These weren't just losses, they were public autopsies, performed live for the world to see, revealing the decay within. The first crack in the marble, the first tremor that suggested the foundations were unstable, came in the eternal city of Rome in April 2018. Barcelona arrived at the Stadio Olimpico for their Champions League quarter-final second leg, radiating an aura of invincibility. They were unbeaten in both La Liga and Europe, and they carried a comfortable 4-1 lead from the first leg at the Camp Nou. Qualification for the semi-finals was Barcelona simply couldn't match. Manager Eusebio Di Francesco had switched his team to an aggressive 3-4-3 formation, pressing high and relentlessly, suffocating Barcelona's attempts to play out from the back. Just 6 minutes in, the unthinkable began to seem possible. A long ball from Daniel De Rossi, a pass he was given all the time in the world to make, sailed over a static Barca defense, finding Edin Dzeko. The big striker held off his man and slotted the ball past the goalkeeper. 1-0, the stadium erupted. Hope had been ignited. Barcelona looked rattled, devoid of ideas. Manager Ernesto Valverde's narrow for foot two was being completely overwhelmed. Messi, the team's savior on so many occasions, was a ghost, forced to drop deep into his own half just to touch the ball. The team was playing without urgency, as if they still believed their 3-goal cushion was safe. They were wrong. The second half began just as the first had ended, with Roma playing like a team possessed and Barcelona looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. 13 minutes after the restart, Gerard Piqué clumsily pulled Dzeko down in the box. Penalty. Club captain Daniel De Rossi stepped up and buried it. 2-0, the aggregate score was 4-3. Roma needed just one more goal. The air was thick with tension and belief. Barcelona were paralyzed by fear, unable to respond. Then, with just 8 minutes left on the clock, the moment of reckoning arrived. A corner was whipped in towards the near post. Barcelona's players stood in stunned silence, hands on hips, staring into the abyss. They had completely, utterly collapsed out of the empire. If Rome was a warning, Anfield a year later was the siren, a full-blown crisis klaxon that could not be ignored. This time it was the semi-final. Barcelona had produced a moment of Messi magic to secure a seemingly unassailable 3-0 victory in the first leg at home. They travelled to Liverpool, a fortress of European football, but a fortress whose two greatest warriors, Mohamed Salah and Roberto Firmino, were out injured. Surely, lightning couldn't strike twice. Surely, they had learned their lesson. They hadn't. From the first whistle, Liverpool, roared on by a ferocious home crowd, unleashed a storm of high-pressing fury. After just 7 minutes, a poor header from Jordi Alba was seized upon, and Divock Origi, Firmino's stand-in, tapped in the rebound to make it 1-0. Hope, once again, was alive. Barcelona were rattled, but they survived until half-time. At the break, Liverpool's energetic left-back, Andy Robertson, succumbed to an injury. On came a midfielder, Jorginho Wijnaldum. What happened next was the stuff of legend. Within 9 minutes of the restart, Trent Alexander-Arnold won the ball and fired a low cross into the box. Wijnaldum, making a late run, met it with a low drive that squeezed past the goalkeeper. 2-0, Anfield was rocking. Barcelona were crumbling. Rose like a titan, his powerful header flying into the top corner. 3-0, in the space of 2 minutes, the tie was level. Barcelona's players looked utterly shell-shocked, ghosts on the pitch haunted by the memories of Rome. And then came the moment that will forever define this collapse. The coup de grace. With 11 minutes remaining, Liverpool won a corner. As the Barcelona players switched off, lazily getting into defensive position, not one of them looking at the ball, a 20-year-old Trent Alexander-Arnold saw his chance. He feigned to walk away, then darted back, whipping a quick, low corner into the near post. Divock Origi, the only player alert to the possibility. It was a moment of pure genius from Liverpool, but it was a moment of catastrophic, unforgivable negligence from Barcelona. The most experienced players in the world, caught completely asleep at the most critical moment. It was the perfect metaphor for the entire club, complacent, arrogant, and mentally broken. The final whistle blew on one of the greatest comebacks in Champions League history. For Barcelona, it was a repeat nightmare, a humiliation so profound it triggered an existential crisis. The empire wasn't just cracking, it was shattering. But the ultimate degradation, the absolute nadir, the moment the empire was not just shattered but publicly executed, was still to come. The quarter-final of the 2020 Champions League, played in a neutral, pandemic-enforced single-leg tie in Lisbon, pitted Barcelona against the German champions, Bayern Munich. What happened next wasn't a football match, it was an annihilation, a public dismemberment so brutal it left scars that may never heal. Bayern were a machine, a relentless red wave of pressing and power. Within 4 minutes, Thomas Müller had made it 1-0. Though a bizarre own goal from David Alaba briefly levelled the scores, it was a fleeting respite. By the 31st minute, it was 4-1. Goals from Ivan Perry, Serge Gnabry, slow, and tactically clueless, their high defensive line exploited again and again. Luis Suarez pulled a goal back early in the second half to make it 4-2, a brief flicker of hope. Then came a moment that perfectly encapsulated the athletic chasm between the two clubs. Bayern's 19-year-old left-back, Alphonso Davies, picked up the ball on the sideline. He skipped past Messi, danced around Arturo Vidal, and then faced Barca's right-back, Nelson Semedo. Davies turned him inside out, leaving him for dead with a devastating burst of pace before squaring the ball for Joshua Kimmich to tap in for 5-2. It was a soul-snatching moment of individual brilliance that exposed just how far Barcelona had fallen. The humiliation, however, was not yet complete. The script required one final, poetic act of cruelty. With 15 minutes to go, Bayern brought on a substitute, Philippe Coutinho. the man Barcelona had signed for over €140 million to replace Neymar, the symbol of their reckless spending, now on loan to the German giants. In the 82nd minute, he delivered a perfect cross for Robert Lewandowski to head home for Bear. "It was a horrible performance, we have hit rock bottom," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Shame is the word. The club needs changes. Not just the players, I don't want to point out anyone, we need changes on a structural level. He even offered to leave himself if it would help. These weren't just losses. They were verdicts. Rome was a sign of complacency. Liverpool was proof of mental collapse. But Lisbon? Lisbon was the declaration of death. It was the on-field consequence of years of terrible decisions in the boardroom, the final, brutal bill for the era of excess. The Emperor had no clothes, just a balance sheet soaked in red ink and a team drowning in shame. As the on-field disasters mounted, the horrifying scale of the financial hole dug by Bartomeu's board finally came to light. The club was in a death spiral of debt. When the final audit was complete, the gross debt stood at an eye-watering €1.35 billion, with the club's net worth at a negative €451 million. The club was, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. Cash flow had evaporated, and they were struggling to pay their bills, including player salaries. Then, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. For a club already living on the financial edge, it was a knockout blow. The sudden loss of game day revenue, museum tours, and merchandise sales was something the club simply couldn't absorb. Unlike well-run clubs, Barcelona had no safety net, no contingency plan. The pandemic didn't cause the crisis, but it exposed it in the most brutal fashion, pushing an already teetering institution right over the cliff. But the scandal went beyond simple incompetence. A storm was brewing that would stain the club with allegations of corruption. It became known as Barçagate. In early 2020, reports surfaced that Bartomeu's board had paid a company, i3 Ventures, nearly €1 million, supposedly to manage the club's social media. The payments were allegedly split into smaller invoices under €200,000 to avoid internal oversight. Investigations revealed a much darker purpose. This company was accused of creating a network of social media accounts to launch smear campaigns. The targets weren't rival teams, but people seen as enemies of the board. This included presidential candidates, critical journalists, and, most shockingly, club legends like Pep Guardiola, Xavi, and even active players Gerard Piqué and Lionel Messi. The club's own icons were being secretly attacked online, with the attacks allegedly paid for by the club's own money, all to protect the president's reputation. The scandal was a moral catastrophe. It revealed a culture of paranoia and malice at the very top. Bartomeu and other board members were eventually arrested in March 2021 as part of a police investigation into alleged improper management and corruption. It was the sordid final chapter of his presidency. He resigned in October 2020, just ahead of a vote of no confidence, leaving behind a club that was not only broke and a sporting wreck, but also morally bankrupt. He had taken an empire and left behind a smoking crater. The stage was set for the most painful moment in the club's modern history. In the bleak landscape of early 2021, with the club morally, financially, and spiritually bankrupt, a glimmer of hope appeared. It arrived in the form of a familiar face, a returning hero from a bygone, glorious era. In March, Joan Laporta, the charismatic architect of the club's most dominant period, was re-elected as president in a landslide victory. This wasn't just a routine election, it was a desperate plea from the club's members, the socios, for a savior. They were turning to the man who had presided over the Golden Age, the man who had appointed Pep Guardiola, the man who understood the sacred philosophy of Johan Cruyff. Laporta's return felt like a potential sunrise after an endless, dark night. The night that had been the reign of Josep Maria Bartomeu, a presidency that left behind not just a sporting wreck, but a smoking crater of debt and disgrace. The club was drowning in a €1.35 billion liability, its reputation stained by the sordid allegations of Barçagate, a scandal that saw the club's own money allegedly used to smear its own legends. The humiliations on the pitch in Rome, Liverpool, and Lisbon were merely the external symptoms of this internal decay. The institution was broken. Laporta's campaign was built on a single, sacred promise, a pledge that resonated with every single Barcelona fan on the planet: he would convince Lionel Messi to stay. After years of growing frustration with Bartomeu's directionless leadership, the embarrassing Champions League exits, and the ultimate betrayal of learning the club was allegedly paying to attack his own family online, Messi's desire to leave had become an open secret. His contract was expiring, and his exit felt like a grim certainty, the final chapter in the club's tragic implosion. But Laporta's return was seen as the one thing that could change the narrative. He and Messi had a history, a deep mutual respect forged during the years of unparalleled success. Laporta wasn't just promising to keep a footballer, he was promising to restore the club's very soul by securing the loyalty of the man who embodied it. He was promising to keep the king in his castle, to ensure that the greatest story in the club's history would not end in a bitter divorce. Everyone believed that if any man could navigate this catastrophe and mend this broken relationship, it was him. A wave of fragile optimism washed over Catalonia. For the first time in years, it felt like the nightmare might be ending. At first, the fairytale seemed to be coming true. The early signs were overwhelmingly positive. Laporta, a master of public relations, radiated confidence. He and Messi were pictured together, smiling, embracing. The cold, toxic atmosphere of the Bartomeu years began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of renewed purpose and mutual affection. The negotiations began, and behind the scenes, the message was clear: both sides desperately wanted to find a solution. Messi, the boy who had arrived from Argentina as a shy 13-year-old and became a global icon, the living embodiment of La Masia's potential, did not want to leave his home of 2 decades. He had watched the club that nurtured him devolve into a farce, a disjointed collection of overpriced misfits with no coherent plan. He had endured the soul-crushing defeats, the public humiliations, all while the boardroom seemed obsessed with everything but building a cohesive team. His loyalty had been tested to its absolute limit. Yet, with Laporta back at the helm, he was willing to make an unprecedented sacrifice. It was widely reported, and later confirmed, that an agreement in principle had been reached. Messi, the same player whose last contract was worth a staggering €555 million, agreed to a dramatic, almost unbelievable 50% pay cut. This wasn't a standard negotiation tactic, it was a profound statement of intent. It was an act of supreme loyalty from a player who had given everything to the club. He was willing to slash his own earnings in half to help save the institution he loved from the financial abyss it had been plunged into by others. The news spread like wildfire. The crisis was averted. The deal was done. The press, the fans, the entire football world took a collective sigh of relief. The narrative was set: Laporta had fulfilled his promise, the king had made a noble sacrifice, and the great rebuilding could finally begin with its cornerstone firmly in place. It looked like the fairy tale would continue. The darkest hour was just before the dawn. But then, reality bit. And it bit with the venom of a serpent. The poison, so carefully and recklessly injected into the club's finances by the previous administration, was a ticking time bomb that not even Laporta's charisma or Messi's sacrifice could defuse. The problem was no longer just Barcelona's own internal mess, it was an external, immovable object in the form of Spain's La Liga and its stringent financial fair play regulations. These weren't friendly guidelines, they were a hard, unforgiving salary cap. The league dictates that a club's total wage bill simply cannot exceed a specific percentage of its recognized revenue. There is no wiggle room, no special dispensation for legends, no exception for fairy tale endings. It is a cold, hard, mathematical reality. As Laporta and his new board delved deeper into the financial statements they inherited, that smoking crater left by Bartomeu, the horrifying, complete picture of the disaster became clear. The numbers were apocalyptic. Even with Lionel Messi agreeing to slash his monumental salary by half, Barcelona's projected wage bill for the upcoming season was still calculated to be around 110% of their total income. Let that sink in. The club was set to spend 10% more than every single euro it brought in, just on player salaries. The situation was so dire that even if they removed Messi's reduced contract from the books entirely, their wage bill would still sit at a catastrophic 95% of revenue, far above the league's 70% threshold. Signing their greatest ever player, even at a 50% discount, was, by the immutable laws of the league, literally impossible. The damage was too profound, the rot too deep. Every disastrous decision of the Bartomeu era had led to this single, heartbreaking moment of paralysis. The hundreds of millions wasted in the panic-driven aftermath of the Neymar sale, on players like Ousmane Dembélé and Philippe Coutinho, signings that were a complete betrayal of the club's philosophy, were now a lead weight on the balance sheet. The mind-boggling €120 million spent on Antoine Griezmann, another brilliant player with no tactical home. The bizarre accounting-driven swap of Arthur for an aging Pjanic. These weren't just poor sporting decisions, they were crippling financial anchors. Compounding this were the massive, logic-defying contract extensions handed out to an aging squad, rewarding past performance with future-destroying salaries. The wage bill had spiraled so far out of control, hitting over €600 million a year, that the club was functionally insolvent. Bartomeu's board had been running a pyramid scheme, mortgaging the future to pay for the present. Now, the future had arrived, and the bill was due. The hope of the last few months evaporated in an instant, replaced by the chilling, impossible truth. Laporta now faced an impossible choice, a true devil's bargain. There was one potential lifeline, one escape hatch that could, in theory, solve the immediate problem. The league, in partnership with a private equity firm, CVC, was offering a deal. Clubs could opt in, and in return for an immediate cash injection, they would have to sign away a percentage of their television rights revenue for the next 50 years. This influx of cash would have instantly fixed Barcelona's salary cap issue. It would have allowed them to register Lionel Messi, to fulfill the promise, to deliver the happy ending everyone craved. The temptation must have been immense. It was a quick fix, a way out of an excruciatingly painful dilemma. He could save the day. He could keep the king. But at what cost? Laporta looked at the CVC deal and saw a trap. He saw it as a repetition of the very same short-sighted, destructive thinking that had brought the club to its knees. It was another mortgage on the club's future, a desperate gamble to solve today's problem by sacrificing tomorrow's income. It was, in his view, a fundamental betrayal of the club's ownership model, a betrayal of the socios who had just elected him to clean up the mess, not create a new one. Accepting the deal would have been to follow the path of his predecessor, choosing extravagance and illusion over sustainability and responsibility. It wasn't bread for today, hunger for tomorrow. After agonizing deliberation, Laporta made the unbearable decision. He would not sell off a piece of the club's soul for the next half-century. He chose what he believed was the only responsible long-term path, even if it meant walking through fire in the short term. The consequence of that decision was as unavoidable as it was tragic. On August 5, 2021, the club released a statement that sent a shockwave through the entire sporting world. It was cold, corporate, and utterly devastating. Despite FC Barcelona and Lionel Messi having reached an agreement and the clear intention of both parties to sign a new contract today, this cannot happen because of financial and structural obstacles, Spanish La Liga regulations. Those words, financial and structural obstacles, were the official epitaph for a two-decade love affair. They were the cold, sterile language used to describe a passion play of epic proportions. The greatest player in the history of the club, perhaps the history of the game, a man who had agreed to cut his pay in half to stay, was being forced out. The news was met with stunned disbelief. It couldn't be real. There had to be another way. But there wasn't. The dream was over. A few days later, Lionel Messi held his own press conference. The world watched, transfixed, as the man who had so often communicated with his feet, a man famously reserved and private, walked to a podium in front of the club's trophies and broke down completely before he could even utter a single word. Sobs racked his body. This was not the choreographed exit of a modern athlete, this was the raw, unfiltered grief of a man being exiled from his home. Through tears, he explained his side of the story. He confirmed that he had done everything he could to stay, that he and his family wanted nothing more than to remain in Barcelona, that he had accepted the 50% pay cut without hesitation. "I thought it was all agreed upon," he managed to say, his voice cracking, but at the last minute, because of the La Liga issue, it couldn't be done. His departure was the final, brutal, tangible consequence of all the years of scandal and waste. It was the moment the bill for the entire era of mismanagement finally came due, and the price was the club's very soul. The original sin of the panicked Neymar spending spree, the institutional arrogance, the farcical transfer policy, the ruinous wage bill, the moral bankruptcy of Barçagate, the on-pitch humiliations, all of it culminated in this one, heartbreaking image of a crying legend forced out of the club he defined. In his grief, he uttered a line that hung heavy in the air, a quiet indictment of the institution he loved. "I don't know if the club did everything possible," he said. "What I'm clear on is that I did." It was the symbolic death of an empire, the tragic, gut-wrenching end to a beautiful era, not because of a rival or a hostile takeover, but because the institution had rotted from the inside out, so completely that it could no longer even afford to exist with its greatest ever son. With the king exiled and the kingdom in ashes, Joan Laporta stood amidst the ruins. He had been elected as a savior, only to be forced to preside over the club's most painful amputation. The departure of Lionel Messi was not the end of the crisis, it was the beginning of a brutal, desperate fight for the club's very existence. The task ahead was monumental, a Herculean effort to save a bankrupt institution from complete liquidation while somehow, impossibly, keeping it competitive on the field. Laporta's administration was not merely taking over a football club, they were inheriting a financial crime scene, and the first order of business was to stop the bleeding. This began with a great and terrible purge, a necessary but agonizing process of dismantling the gilded cage that the previous board had built. The wage bill, a grotesque monument to the Bartomeu era's recklessness, had to be torn down, brick by painful brick. This was not a simple matter of negotiation, it was a form of financial surgery without anesthetic. The first goodbyes were the hardest, as they meant severing ties with the last vestiges of the Golden Age. Gerard Piqué, the warrior who had stood before the cameras after the 8-2 humiliation in Lisbon and declared that the club had hit rock bottom and needed structural change, now embodied that change. His emotional retirement mid-season was not just the end of a legendary career, it was a final act of service. A stalwart of the greatest Barcelona teams in history stepped aside, sacrificing his own salary and contract to give his boyhood club a sliver of financial breathing room. Soon, he was followed by the metronomic heart of the old system. The departures of captain Sergio Busquets and Jordi Alba felt like the final echoes of the tiki-taka symphony fading into silence. These were not just aging veterans, they were the last two active players from the starting lineup of the mythical 2011 Champions League final. They were the living embodiment of the Cruyff-Guardiola philosophy. Watching them leave was to watch a chapter of history close, the institutional memory of the club's greatest triumphs walking out the door. But their enormous salaries, relics of a bygone era of largesse, were anchors the club could no longer afford to carry. Laporta's board was then forced into a frantic fire sale, aggressively trying to loan out or sell any player on a high wage who wasn't deemed absolutely essential by the new manager, club legend Xavi Hernandez. It was a desperate attempt to shed the dead weight of past mistakes, to offload the expensive, ill-fitting signings from the fantasy football recruitment era, and to escape the ruinous long-term contracts that had brought the institution to its knees. But even this brutal cost-cutting was like using a bucket to bail out a sinking ocean liner. It wasn't enough. To satisfy La Liga's draconian financial regulations and, crucially, to fund a desperate rebuild of the squad, Laporta and his board embarked on one of the most audacious and controversial financial strategies in modern sports history. They began to activate a series of what they called palancas, or economic levers. The term sounded technical, almost sophisticated, but the reality was brutally simple: they were selling the club's furniture to avoid foreclosure. It was a high-stakes, high-risk gambit to trade future certainty for immediate survival. The levers were pulled in rapid succession throughout 2022 and 2023, each one sending a shudder through the club's long-term financial foundations. First, they made a pact with an American investment firm, selling off 10% and then another 15% of the club's domestic television rights, the lifeblood of their annual income, for the next 25 years. A full quarter of a century of broadcast revenue, the earnings from games yet to be played, from goals yet to be scored by stars yet to be discovered, was sacrificed for a massive injection of immediate cash. Then came another lever. The board carved off a 49% stake in Barça Studios, the club's in-house media production arm, selling pieces of it to different companies. It was akin to a Hollywood studio selling off the rights to half of its film library to pay the electricity bill. These deals pumped hundreds of millions of euros into the club's depleted coffers. It was a financial adrenaline shot, a defibrillator applied to a heart that had stopped beating. The immediate effect was transformative. With cash in hand, Barcelona could suddenly operate in the transfer market again. They could satisfy La Liga's rules, register new players, and project an image of strength. They signed Polish superstar Robert Lewandowski from Bayern Munich and Brazilian winger Rafinha, signaling to the world that Barcelona was not dead, that the allure of the badge, however tarnished, remained potent. This gamble produced a spectacular short-term dividend. Under Xavi's leadership, the rebuilt team stormed to the La Liga title in the 2022-23 season. For a moment, the pain of the recent past was forgotten. The league trophy was more than just silverware, it was a vindication of Laporta's strategy. It was proof of life. It was a shield against the rising tide of criticism. However, outside the celebratory bubble, many observers looked upon the Palancas with deep skepticism, seeing them not as a clever escape, but as a repetition of the very same short-sighted thinking that had caused the crisis. The phrase, bread for today, hunger for tomorrow, became a constant refrain. Was Laporta a financial genius who had found a loophole to save the club, or was he merely a different kind of gambler, pushing the club's debt into the future, making a Faustian bargain that would come back to haunt his successors? He was betting that the immediate prize money and prestige from winning trophies, combined with future revenue growth, would ultimately be worth more than the steady income streams they had just signed away for a quarter of a century. It was a wager on a future that was far from certain. And hanging over this entire gamble is the largest, most concrete, and most expensive project in the club's history, Espai Barça. This is not just a stadium renovation, it is a complete reimagining of the club's footprint, a multi-billion-euro plan to transform the crumbling Camp Nou into a state-of-the-art, 105,000-seat cathedral of football, surrounded by a new arena, hotel, and commercial campus. In theory, this new complex will be a revenue-generating machine, a financial engine that will secure the club's future for generations. But the reality of its construction is another mountain of debt piled upon the existing one. The project required financing of around 1.5 billion euros, a figure secured from a consortium of investors. When added to the club's existing liabilities, this has pushed Barcelona's total debt obligations into the dizzying, almost incomprehensible neighborhood of 3 billion euros. The immediate consequence of this monumental undertaking has been another form of exile. To allow for the demolition and reconstruction, the team was forced to abandon its sacred home. For the 2023-24 season and beyond, Barcelona has been playing its home games at the Estadio Olímpic Lluís Companys, the city's old Olympic stadium on Montjuic Hill. It is a functional but soulless venue, with a running track separating the fans from the pitch, a stark contrast to the vertical wall of noise at the Camp Nou. This move is not just an emotional blow, it is a financial catastrophe. The Olympic Stadium has a much smaller capacity, and the logistics are more difficult for fans. The club itself has estimated that this temporary relocation is costing them between €90 and €100 million per year in lost revenue from tickets, hospitality, and museum tours. The club is in a desperate race to recover, yet it has been forced to run that race with a massive financial weight strapped to its back. A partial return to a still under construction Camp Nou is desperately hoped for in late 2024 or early 2025, but any delays in the massive construction project push that date back, costing the club tens of millions with every passing month. So the club exists today in a state of profound paradox. On one hand, there is the on-pitch success of a league title and the promise of a glorious new stadium. On the other, there is the terrifying reality of the balance sheet. Laporta has pulled the levers, sold off the future, and taken on unprecedented debt to build an even more expensive future. The entire club is walking a financial tightrope, suspended thousands of feet in the air. The gamble is that they can make it to the other side, to the grand opening of the new Camp Nou, before the long-term cost of the sold assets and the crushing weight of the accumulated debt sends them plummeting into the abyss. The empire has fallen, and its former ruler is desperately trying to build a new one from the rubble, using borrowed money and mortgaged dreams as his foundation. This intricate web of financial recovery, high-stakes gambles, and on-pitch rebuilding is a story that is far from over. If you found this deep dive into the fall of Barcelona's empire compelling, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more investigative sports stories, and let us know in the comments, what do you think the future holds for this iconic club? The story of FC Barcelona's downfall is a modern tragedy, a cautionary tale of how quickly an empire built on genius can be wrecked by arrogance and incompetence. The key factors are crystal clear: a philosophical shift away from the La Masia model towards a reckless star-buying policy, a catastrophic mismanagement of the wage bill under Josep Maria Bartomeu that defied all financial logic, and a series of humiliating defeats that exposed the rot. The heartbreaking departure of Lionel Messi wasn't the cause of the crisis, but its most painful symptom, the moment the world saw the devastating cost of years of scandal. Today, under Joan Laporta, the club is fighting its way back. The latest financial reports show a profit, and credit agencies are more confident in their recovery plan. The wage bill is down, and the Palancas, while risky, gave them the breathing room to avoid collapse and get back to winning in Spain. Still, the club is walking a financial tightrope. The debt from the Espai Barça project is enormous, and the long-term cost of selling off future income is still unknown. All the while, the spectre of the Negreira case, an investigation into millions paid by the club over many years to a company owned by a top refereeing official, continues to loom. Former presidents Bartomeu and Rosell have been indicted in the case, and the club faces potential charges of bribery, which could have severe sporting consequences. The path forward is full of risk. Can Barcelona restore its financial health without sacrificing its ability to compete? Can it finish the new Camp Nou and reap the promised rewards? And maybe most importantly, can it rediscover the values that once made it more than a club? The empire has fallen, shattered by its own hand. The painstaking process of rebuilding from the rubble has begun, but whether it can ever reach those glorious heights again remains the biggest question in world football.